In Search of the Miraculous by P.D. Ouspensky. Chapter 3. After this, G went on to explain man's various functions and centers, controlling these functions, in the way that they are set out in the psychological lectures. These explanations, and all the talks connected with them, took a fairly long time, while at almost every talk we returned to the fundamental ideas of man's mechanicalness, of the absence of unity in man, of man's having no choice, of his being unable to do, and so on. There is no possibility of giving all these talks in the way that they actually took place. For this reason, I collected all the psychological and all the cosmological material in 2 separate series of lectures. In this connection, it must be noted that the ideas were not given us in the form in which they are set out in my lectures. G gave the ideas little by little, as though defending or protecting them from us. When touching on new themes for the first time, he gave only general principles, often holding back the most essential. Sometimes he himself pointed out apparent discrepancies in the theories given, which were, in fact, precisely due to their reservations and suppressions. The next time, in approaching the same subject, whenever possible, from a different angle, he gave more. The third time, he gave still more. On the question of functions and centers, for instance. In the first occasion, he spoke of 3 centers: the intellectual, the emotional, and the moving, and he tried to make us distinguish these functions, find examples, and so on. Afterwards, the instinctive center was added as an independent and self-supporting machine. Afterwards, the sex center. I remember that some of his remarks arrested my attention. For instance, when speaking of the sex center, he said it practically never worked independently because it was always dependent on other centers: the intellectual, the emotional, the instinctive, and the moving. Then, in speaking of the energy of centers, he often returned to what he called wrong work of centers and to that role of the sex center in this work. He spoke a great deal about how the centers rob the sex center of its energy and produce with this energy quite wrong work, full of useless excitement, and, in return, give to the sex center useless energy with which it was unable to work. I remember his words, and then there's a quote here. It is a very big thing when the sex center works with its own energy, but it happens very seldom. End quote. I recollect another remark which afterwards proved a ground for much wrong reasoning and many wrong conclusions. This was that the 3 centers of the lower story, the instinctive, the moving, and the sex centers, work in relation to each other in the order of 3 forces, and that the sex center in normal cases acts as neutralizing force in relation to the instinctive and moving centers, acting as active and passive forces. This method of exposition of which I am speaking, and G's suppression in his first talks, resulted in the creation of such misunderstanding, more particularly in later groups not connected with my own work. Many people found contradictions between the first exposition of a given idea and subsequent explanations, and sometimes in trying to hold as closely as possible to the first, they created fantastic theories having no relation to what G actually said. Thus, the idea of 3 centers was retained by certain groups, which I repeat were not connected with me. And this idea was in some way linked up with the idea of 3 forces, with which, in reality, it had no connection. First of all, because there are not 3 forces, but 5 sources in the ordinary man. This uniting of 2 ideas of an entirely different order, scale, and significance gave rise to any further misunderstandings and completely distorted the whole system for those who thought in this manner. I'm going to reread that last sentence. This uniting of two ideas of an entirely different order, scale, and significance gave rise to many further misunderstandings and completely distorted the whole system for those who thought in this manner. It is possible that the idea of the three centers, intellectual, emotional, and moving, being the expression of the three forces, arose from G's wrongly repeated and wrongly received remarks on the relationship to each other of the three centers of the lower story. During the first and subsequent talks on centers, G added something new at almost every talk. As I said in the beginning, he spoke first of three centers, then of 4, then of 5, and afterwards of 7 centers. Parts of centers hardly came into these talks. G said that centers were divided into positive and negative parts, but he did not point out that this division was not identical for all the different centers. Then he said that each center was divided into 3 parts, or 3 stories, which, in their turn, were also divided into 3, but he gave no examples, nor did he point out that observation of attention made it possible to distinguish the work of the parts of the centers. All this, and much else besides, was established later. For instance, although he undoubtedly gave the fundamental basis for the study of the role and the significance of negative emotions, as well as methods of struggling against them, referring to non-identification, non-considering, and non-expressing negative emotions, he did not complete these theories, or did not explain the negative emotions were entirely unnecessary and that no normal center for them existed. I shall further on reproduce the talks and the lectures of the St. Petersburg and later groups in the way that I remember them, while endeavoring to avoid what has already been given in the first and second series of lectures. But it is impossible to avoid repetition in certain cases, and the original exposition of the ideas of the system in the way G gave them, in my opinion, of great interest. Somebody asked at a meeting, how should evolution be understood? G replied, the evolution of man can be taken as the development in him of those powers and possibilities which never develop by themselves, that is, mechanically. Only this kind of development, only this kind of growth marks the real evolution of man. There is and there can be no other kind of evolution whatever. We have before us a man at the present moment of his development. Nature has made him such as he is, and in large masses, so far as we can see, he will remain. Changes likely to violate the general requirements of nature can only take place in separate units. In order to understand the law of man's evolution, it is necessary to grasp that, beyond a certain point, this evolution is not necessary at all. That is to say, it's not necessary for nature at every given Let me start the sentence again. In order to understand the law of man's evolution, it is necessary to grasp that beyond a certain point, this evolution is not at all necessary. That is to say, it is not necessary for nature at any given moment in its own development. To speak more precisely, the evolution of mankind corresponds to the evolution of the planets, but the evolution of the planets proceeds for us in infinitely prolonged cycles of time. Throughout the stretch of time that human thought can embrace, no essential changes can take place in the life of the planets, and consequently, no essential changes can take place in the life of mankind. Humanity neither progresses nor evolves. What seems to be progress or evolution is a partial modification, which can be immediately counterbalanced by a corresponding modification in an opposite direction. Humanity, like the rest of organic life, exists on Earth for the needs and purposes of the Earth, and it is exactly as it should be for the earth's requirements at the present time. Only thought as theoretical and far removed from fact as modern European thought could have conceived the evolution of man to be possible apart from the surrounding nature, or have regarded the evolution of man as a gradual conquest of nature. This is quite impossible. In living, in dying, in evolving, in degenerating, man equally serves the purposes of nature, or rather, nature makes equal use, though perhaps for different purposes, of the products of both evolution and degeneration. And at the same time, humanity as a whole can never escape from nature, for even in struggling against nature, man acts in conformity with her purposes. The evolution of large masses of humanity is opposed to nature's purposes. The evolution of certain small percentage may be in accord with nature's purposes. Man contains within him the possibility of evolution, but the evolution of humanity as a whole, that is, the development of these possibilities in all men, or in most men, or even in a large number of them, is not necessary for the purposes of the earth and of the planetary world in general, and it might, in fact, be injurious or fatal. There exist, therefore, special forces of a planetary character which oppose the evolution of large masses of humanity and keep it at a level it ought to be. For instance, the evolution of humanity beyond a certain point, or to speak more correctly, above a certain percentage, would be fatal for the moon. The moon at present feeds on organic life, on humanity. Humanity is part of organic life. This means that our humanity is food for the moon. If all men were to become too intelligent, they would not want to be eaten by the moon. If all men were to become too intelligent, they would not want to be eaten by the moon. But at the same time, possibilities of evolution exist, and they may be developed in separate individuals with the help of appropriate knowledge and methods. Such development can take place only in the interests of the man himself, against, so to speak, the interests and the forces of the planetary world. The man must understand this. His evolution is necessary only to himself. No one else is interested in it, and no one else is obliged or intends to help him. On the contrary, the forces which oppose the evolution of large masses of humanity also oppose the evolution of individual men. A man must outwit them, and one man can outwit them. Humanity cannot. You will understand later on that these obstacles are very useful to man. If they did not exist, they would have to be created intentionally, because it is by overcoming obstacles that man develops those qualities he needs. This is the basis of the correct view of human evolution. There is no compulsion, mechanical evolution. There is no compulsory mechanical evolution. Evolution is the result of conscious struggle. Nature does not need this evolution. It does not want it and struggles against it. Evolution can be necessary only to man himself when he realizes his position, realizes the possibility of changing his position, realizes that he has powers that he does not use, riches that he does not see, and, in the sense of gaining possession over these powers and riches, evolution is possible. But if all men, most of them realize this, desired to obtain what belonged to them by right of birth, evolution would again become impossible. What is possible for individual man is impossible for the masses. The advantage of the separate individual is that he is very small, and that in the economy of nature it makes no difference whether there is one mechanical man more or less. We can easily understand this correlation of magnitudes if we imagine the correlation between a microscopic cell and our own body. The presence or the absence of one cell will change nothing in the life of the body. We cannot be conscious of it, and it can have no influence on the life and the function of the organism. In exactly the same way, an individual, a separate individual, is too small to influence the life of the cosmic organism to which he stands in the same relation with regard to size as a cell stands to our own organism. And this is precisely what makes his evolution possible. On this are based his possibilities. In speaking of evolution, it's necessary to understand from the outset that no mechanical evolution is possible. The evolution of man is the evolution of his consciousness. And consciousness cannot evolve unconsciously. The evolution of man is the evolution of his will, and will cannot evolve involuntarily. The evolution of man is the evolution of his power of doing, and doing cannot be the result of things which happen. People do not know what man is. They have to do with a very complex machine, far more complex than a railway engine, a motor car, or an aeroplane. But they know nothing, or almost nothing, about the construction, working, or possibilities of this machine. They do not even understand its simplest functions, because they do not know the purpose of these functions. They vaguely imagine that a man should learn to control his machine, just as he has to learn to control a railway engine, a motor car, or an airplane, and that incompetent handling of the human machine is just as dangerous as incompetent handling of any other complex machine. Everybody understands this in relation to an airplane, a motor car, or a railway engine, but it is very rarely that anyone takes this into account in relation to man in general, or to himself in particular. It is considered right and legitimate to think that nature has given men the necessary knowledge of their machine, and yet men understand that an instinctive knowledge of the machine is by no means enough. Why do they study medicine and make use of its services? Because, of course, they realize that they do not know their machine, but they do not suspect that it can be known much better than science knows it. They do not suspect that then it would be possible to get quite different work out of it.